Tonight, the Middle East stands on the edge once again. A growing confrontation between Iran and the United States is rapidly escalating beyond diplomacy. As tensions rise around the Strait of Hormuz, global oil routes are under pressure, naval forces are moving into position, and fears of a wider regional conflict are growing by the hour. But this crisis is no longer limited to the Persian Gulf. New reports suggest alternative land corridors may now be emerging through Pakistan, potentially reshaping the geopolitical battlefield entirely. From Washington to Tehran, from India's energy concerns to military calculations across the Gulf, the world is entering a dangerous new phase of uncertainty. The next 48 hours could decide whether this confrontation returns to diplomacy or moves one step closer to a much larger war. The situation has now reached a highly dangerous turning point. According to Iranian media reports, a senior security source warned that if the United States continues intercepting vessels linked to Iran, Tehran could respond with what was described as an unprecedented military action. Iranian military officials reportedly believe that patience has limits, and that continued pressure in regional waters could trigger a far stronger response. At the same time, tensions between Washington and Tehran continue to rise sharply. Former U.S. President Donald Trump has repeatedly argued that Iran can only be forced back to negotiations through maximum pressure and maritime restrictions. Iranian officials, however, have signaled that any further seizure of ships or escalation at sea could carry serious consequences. There are also growing reports suggesting that alternative land trade routes may be expanding through neighboring countries, potentially allowing Iran to continue moving oil and commercial goods despite sanctions and naval pressure. These developments have added another layer of complexity to an already fragile regional crisis. Meanwhile, political rhetoric on both sides has intensified dramatically. Critics say the confrontation with Iran has become one of the central issues dominating Trump's public messaging, with late-night statements and aggressive warnings continuing to fuel tensions online and across international media. According to reports carried by Iranian state-linked outlets, an unnamed high-level security source claimed that what they described as maritime piracy by the United States would eventually receive a direct and practical response. The source reportedly warned that if naval restrictions around the Strait of Hormuz continue, Iran may feel compelled to respond more aggressively. Iranian officials have also argued that recent regional conflicts demonstrated that Tehran is no longer viewed as an isolated or easily pressured adversary. They credit the country's military preparedness, domestic resilience, and leadership structure for what they describe as their ability to counter foreign pressure and strategic threats. The same source reportedly claimed that Iran had shown restraint in recent months in order to leave room for diplomacy and avoid a wider regional war. According to the statement, Tehran believed negotiations could still create a path toward reducing tensions permanently. However, Iranian officials now argue that Washington has remained unwilling to change course or acknowledge realities on the ground. Another major voice entering the discussion was Mohsen Reza, a senior advisor connected to Iran's leadership establishment. He warned that any new military action against Iran could have devastating consequences for the United States and its regional presence. In a strongly worded statement, he claimed that history would remember the current confrontation as a moment when Iran challenged American influence in the Persian Gulf and surrounding waters. At the same time, Trump's messaging has become increasingly dramatic and confrontational. Social media posts portraying strength, military imagery, and hardline rhetoric have become a major part of the ongoing information battle surrounding the crisis. Analysts say this reflects not only political strategy, but also the enormous pressure building around the standoff. In one of his latest statements, Trump insisted that negotiations with Iran cannot move forward unless Tehran abandons any path toward nuclear weapons capability. Iran, however, continues to reject external pressure and argues that its strategic policies will not be dictated through sanctions or military threats. With both sides escalating their language and regional tensions continuing to grow, observers fear that even a small incident in the Gulf could rapidly spiral into a much larger confrontation. To fully understand the current crisis, it is important to examine the facts being debated in the international arena. Critics of Washington's position argue that many of the demands now being placed on Iran are not entirely new. They point out that Iran joined the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty in 1970 as a non-nuclear state, and for decades Tehran's official position has been that it does not seek nuclear weapons. Since the early 2000s, Iranian officials have repeatedly stated that their nuclear program is intended for civilian and peaceful purposes. Supporters of Tehran's argument also reference the 2015 nuclear agreement, formerly known as the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or JCPOA, in which Iran accepted major restrictions and international inspections in exchange for sanctions relief. The agreement was presented at the time as proof that Iran's nuclear activities could remain under international monitoring. Because of this history, many observers are now asking a difficult question. If Iran has publicly repeated these positions for years, then what exactly is the end goal of the current confrontation? Critics argue that the growing military tension appears disconnected from the diplomatic framework that already existed in the past. Meanwhile, former U.S. President Donald Trump continues to insist that pressure must remain on Tehran until stronger guarantees are secured regarding Iran's nuclear ambitions. In several speeches and public remarks, Trump has argued that Iran must make broader concessions before negotiations can fully move forward again. At the same time, scenes emerging from inside Iran are being used by Iranian media to project an image of national unity and resistance. State-linked outlets have circulated videos showing public gatherings, rallies, and demonstrations in support of the country's armed forces. In one widely shared clip, a newly married couple was shown participating in patriotic celebrations shortly after their wedding ceremony. Another video reportedly showed large convoys of Iranian truck drivers organizing rallies in support of the military and national leadership. These images are being presented by Iranian commentators as evidence that public morale remains strong despite economic sanctions, diplomatic isolation, and military pressure. Analysts often note that in prolonged geopolitical confrontations, public resilience and national unity can become as important as military strength itself. Supporters of Iran's position argue that external threats alone are unlikely to force Tehran into submission if large sections of the population continue rallying behind the state during moments of crisis. On the other hand, critics of the Iranian government argue that state-controlled media often amplifies carefully selected images to project strength during politically sensitive periods. International media outlets have also reported on Trump's increasingly confrontational rhetoric toward Iran. In several remarks, he warned that Tehran needs to get smart quickly, signaling that Washington still favors a hardline approach. At the same time, reports suggest the United States has been trying to prevent a wider regional escalation involving Lebanon and Israel, preferring limited operations over a broader war that could destabilize the Middle East even further. Observers say one of the biggest concerns surrounding the crisis is unpredictability. The rapid shifts in policy, aggressive public messaging, and conflicting diplomatic signals have created uncertainty across the region. Many fear that a single miscalculation by any side could trigger a much larger conflict. According to reports discussed by international media, Trump has also continued supporting the idea of maintaining strong maritime pressure on Iran. Sources familiar with internal discussions claim that some officials believe extending naval restrictions and economic pressure remains the most effective way to push Tehran back toward negotiations without launching another direct military campaign. However, Iran has already warned that continued interference with its shipping routes or commercial vessels could provoke retaliation. This leaves the region facing a dangerous stalemate. Washington believes pressure will force concessions, while Tehran insists that more pressure will only harden its response. As tensions rise across the Gulf region, Many analysts warn that the margin for error is becoming dangerously small.
The strategy being discussed in Washington is not without serious risks. The conflict has now stretched deep into its 9th week, despite earlier predictions from former U.S. President Donald Trump that the crisis would be resolved much sooner. Instead, the prolonged standoff is beginning to create economic and political consequences far beyond the Middle East. Countries across Asia are already feeling the pressure. Rising instability around the Strait of Hormuz has disrupted shipping routes and increased uncertainty in global energy markets. In Europe, concerns have reportedly grown within the aviation sector as fuel prices continue climbing and international flight operations face mounting logistical challenges.
Today, there was another round of warnings about the dire consequences on the oil market if the Strait of Hormuz remains closed for much longer. From analysts at J.P. Morgan and Morgan Stanley, the latter reportedly said in a note that its oil market is in a race against time and that in the worst-case scenario, where the Strait of Hormuz remains closed, global oil could hit $150 a barrel this summer. And as the strait remains at a standstill, the latest travel method at risk because of skyrocketing jet fuel prices could be short-haul flights. They're often a summer staple, typically under 3 hours, inexpensive and popular for European vacations.
Strait of Hormuz has been in a chokehold since the start of the Iran war last month. Roughly 20% of global oil supply normally passes through the strait. And while oil prices don't directly translate to jet fuel overnight, they typically move in tandem within days to weeks.
Not since the 1970s, when there was the initial Arab oil embargo, have we seen anything like this.
Jet fuel makes up a quarter to nearly a third of airline operating costs, meaning even a $10 to $15 per barrel increase in oil can have a huge impact.
Industry analysts warn that if tensions continue escalating, airlines around the region could face severe operational strain. But the economic damage is not limited to Europe alone. The United States is also feeling the consequences of the prolonged confrontation. With energy prices rising and global trade routes under pressure, public frustration inside America has reportedly increased as the conflict drags on. Political observers note that concerns over inflation, fuel costs, and military spending are beginning to affect domestic opinion regarding the crisis. Reports from Washington suggest that the financial burden of the conflict has become substantial. According to officials familiar with defense discussions, the overall cost of U.S. military operations connected to the Iran crisis has continued rising into the tens of billions of dollars. Analysts say these growing expenses have also created anxiety inside the Republican Party ahead of future political battles and election campaigns. Meanwhile, countries such as Pakistan are actively trying to protect their strategic interests and maintain diplomatic channels with all sides involved. Pakistan has historically maintained important economic and energy ties with Iran, particularly because of trade routes and regional connectivity projects. Another major development attracting attention involves reports regarding possible overland trade routes through Pakistan. According to claims circulating among regional journalists and geopolitical observers, Pakistan may be exploring ways to facilitate transportation corridors that could help Iran continue moving oil and commercial goods despite maritime restrictions in the Gulf. Maps and satellite route discussions shared online suggest that because Iran and Pakistan share a border, overland logistics networks could become increasingly important if maritime pressure intensifies further. Analysts say such routes could potentially help Iranian exports reach neighboring regions, including parts of South Asia and Western China. These reports highlight an important reality of modern geopolitics. When traditional trade routes are restricted, countries often search for alternative economic corridors and regional partnerships. Even under heavy sanctions or naval pressure, alternative logistical networks can emerge surprisingly quickly. Still, despite these developments, the overall atmosphere remains extremely tense. Diplomatic experts warn that the next 24 to 48 hours could be critical for regional stability. With military forces operating in close proximity, heightened rhetoric on all sides, and economic pressure continuing to build, Even a small misunderstanding could trigger another dangerous escalation. For now, much of the world is watching closely and hoping that diplomacy, rather than further confrontation, ultimately prevails.